With so many opening books, magazine articles and computer databases, preparing your opening repertoire can be like a full-time job. But if you're like me and you actually prefer playing chess to studying it, then you should consider the system I'm going to recommend today. The great beauty of this opening is that you can learn it very quickly. And what's more, the chances are your opponent will never have seen it before. I've been playing this opening for nearly 10 years, but I'm still able to surprise world-class grandmasters with it because it's such an obscure line. The opening begins, e4, normal move by white, and black plays 1 g6. White completes the occupation of the centre with d4, and in turn black completes the fianchetto with bishop g7. Now the most normal way for white to play here is to reinforce the centre with knight c3. The point behind white's strategy is basically to control and consolidate the centre. And now the most usual move for black is to play d6, and here we have a typical modern structure. But considering this has been seen for the last 100 years and thousands of people have played it, I'm not going to show you that today. I'm going to show you something totally different which you may never have seen before, which is to play instead 3c6. At first sight this move looks ridiculous, like just ask the knight on b8 what it thinks of the move. It can no longer come to c6. It also seems to do nothing for black's development, and after all that is the main purpose of the opening. So it looks at first sight that I'm trying to sell you a dummy. A move like c6 looks totally anti-positional. Now, there's basically 3 main moves which white can play, and these will form 3 independent sections in this video. The 3 main moves are as follows. 1, f4, an attempt by white to grab even more of the centre. Alternatively, white can try bishop c4, more subtle but a very tricky move. And thirdly, knight f3, a move which I consider to be rather boring but nevertheless very popular. And finally we'll just consider some other ideas for white. Bishop e3, or g3, or even something quite wild like h4. But before we look at any precise variations, let's just talk generally about the move 3c6. As I said earlier, one benefit is it takes white away from the main theoretical variations. Now this is obviously going to discomfort the opponent who's been just all geared up to play lots of theoretical moves. And what's more, if you've ever, for instance, faced the Austrian attack in the mainline Pirc, you can understand why I'm so anxious to avoid these main theoretical lines. By playing 3-6 we really throw white and force them to think on their own terms. But it isn't enough just to play something unusual. For instance, we could also play 3a5, or even better, we could try h5. It isn't enough to be unusual, as I said. It also has to have some independent merit, and the move 3c6 certainly does. The move doesn't stand in its own right. The idea is obviously to challenge the centre, and we challenge the centre with the pawn thrust d5. This is the crux of the opening. Black allows white to take the centre and then prepares to sort of make a direct challenge. Alternatively, c6 also prepares b5. Now this is much less common than d5, but it's certainly an option to be borne in mind. Black prepares a kind of flank attack on the pawn centre. b5 threatens the idea of b4, perhaps to dislodge this knight on c3, and suddenly e4 becomes rather weak. The first move that we're going to consider for white is 4 pawn to f4. Now, white's aim is obvious, to grab as much as the centre as possible. The more centre you can control, the more you can influence the game, and really it looks like black's sort of been left behind a bit. After all, the aim of the opening is to control the centre, and black's moves have been rather peripheral. Look at this bishop on g7, the pawn on c6. They don't seem to be influencing much in the centre of the board. So black's next move is very important and the crux of the whole system. Forward.
A double fianchetto system with black appeals to a lot of players, but in my view it's an idea which has to be used with discretion. There are many dangerous attacking systems for white, and black must know when to duck and when to punch. Remembering theory is hardly the issue here. Instead, a good grasp of positional ideas is the only thing that matters. We're going to look at a number of interesting and still original ideas for black, usually connected with the move 1b6, but which may or may not involve the move g6 as well. And at the end of this DVD, you will have a new and almost wholly original system at your disposal. And in these days of the database and the theory freaks, these hackneyed days, what could be better than that? Before we get into the realm of the illustrative games, I can hear you asking, well, what are the main attractions and advantages in playing this Queen's Fianchetto system of defence or related Hippo positions? Well, the first point is it's very provocative. A lot of players are going to be thrown completely off balance by this method of play that black adopts. It's very unusual. White might not have seen it. There are many ways to go wrong early in the game. It's very original. I mean, in which other system of defence are you going to see black playing moves like the following? For instance, after moves like 3f3, you could be countering energetically in the centre with 3d5. In traditional King's Indian type positions, you could be playing very aggressively like Boris Spassky with h5. Or, after a period of cool defence, you could be turning the tables completely like Nona Gaprindashvili with the active Queen h4. So you can see this is not at all a passive system of defence. And in fact there's a lot of satisfaction in creating something original and new, and I would say that is what this whole system of defence provides from black's point of view. So just to sum up, we're being provocative, we're trying to be original, we're looking to counter-attack, we're trying to create something new, we're steering the game into paths of our choosing. Now we're going to start the show with a game from the Dubai Open 2002, and this is an exemplary...
Hello, I'm International Master Andrew Martin, and on this all-new 3-part series for Foxy Openings, I'm going to teach you how to play the modern defence. The modern defence, that's the line where black sets up with g6 and bishop g7 against virtually anything that white does, is an elastic and dynamic way of playing. It is suitable for the club player if you know what you're doing, and the purpose of this DVD series for Foxy Openings is to help you to develop a repertoire using the modern defence. I'm going to split this DVD series down into 3 parts. In the first DVD, I'm going to be covering 2 common and very dangerous white attacking systems. These are the pseudo-Austrian attack, where white sets up with f4, against which I'm going to be recommending the little used but very interesting move e6. And going back to d6, the second line I'm going to be examining is bishop e3, which has become, I think, the most commonly used line for white against the modern defence in 2010. Basically, with bishop e3, white's intentions are very aggressive. He wants to play queen d2, take a look around, and then choose whether to try to blow black away on the king side or just to go for simple, rapid development to try and expose black's, how can I put it, slightly retarded development. But in the modern defence, you know, hanging back with development is part of the system, really. You're kind of waiting to see what white's doing and then you're going to react accordingly. The modern is a very reactive opening in the true hyper-modern spirit. So those are the contents of DVD 1. On DVD 2, I'll be looking at all other white systems that he can adopt using the 1e4 move order. And there are plenty of these. White can set up with bishop e2, that's a classical system. He can set up with c3, He can set up with knight f3 and knight c3. He can set up with bishop c4. He can set up with bishop g5. In general, these systems are less used these days than the Austrian attack or bishop e3, but they are no less important. You can't play the modern defence and have very little knowledge of these other systems. So that's DVD2. And on DVD3, I'm going to be looking again at a very important idea where white transposes to the queen's pawn with c4 and then knight c3. We call this the Averbach system. Black has many ways to react against the Averbach system. Indeed, Mikhail Botvinnik, back in the 1960s when the modern defence was in its infancy, thought that this way of playing for white was the acid test of the modern defence. Of course, you could transpose into a King's Indian here with knight f6, but I'm going to recommend that black, for the time being, stick with an independent move order and play the aggressive move e5. This is a very interesting system. For a long time, this system has been regarded as perhaps slightly dodgy because of the following line. White takes on e5, takes on d8, and then goes f4. But I'm going to try to show that this line doesn't hold too many terrors for black, and as long as you're patient and you know where to put your pieces, there could be chances later on to exploit the gaping hole on d4, or at least tie white down as a result of this weakness in his position. So that will be DVD3. Altogether, the three-part series will add up to a comprehensive repertoire for black in the modern defence, one which I would use, and I've played the modern defence for many years, in competitive games. Alright, well that's about it. It's time to get down to business and move straight on to DVD1. Hello and welcome to DVD2 in this series on the modern defence, Foxy Openings. On the first DVD, you'll recall that we looked at the most aggressive ways that white could proceed from the 1e4 move order. Well, e4 and d4 on the first two moves. We looked at the Austrian attack, where white played with an early f4, and we looked at the line, the very modern line, and the very popular line, where white plays bishop e3. Now we turn our attention to most of the other systems that white can adopt that will appear on a frequent basis, and there are quite a few of them. So the first system I want to tackle is the one where white plays bishop g5 early. On move 4, here we go, bishop g5. And this is almost a throwback to DVD1 because this is also a very aggressive way to play. In common with the line where white played bishop e3, white intends to play queen d2 and, if allowed, at the right moment, bishop h6 to swap off the fianchetto bishop. So it follows that black should not be in too much of a hurry in this system to move his knight on g8. Obviously their knight may have to move, but when it does, you've got to be prepared for bishop h6. Aside from that, white may play f4 before or after queen d2, usually before, and he's arguing that his bishop on g5 is more actively posted than it is on e3 outside the pawn chain. That's also true. So it follows black must be very careful against bishop g5. Positive points to note. Bishop on g5 is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to strikes such as the simple h6, or possibly ideas such as queen a5 via c6 and then queen a5 when the bishop on g5 will be attacked. The most important aspect of this position from my perspective is that d4 is weaker than it was before. With the bishop on e3, attacks on d4 can often rebound in black's face. Well, they're not really attacks at all. But with the bishop on g5, a well-timed attack on d4 can gain valuable time for black. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are pros and cons to bishop g5. And as black, we've got to focus on the positive aspects of our position. Now the move I'm going to recommend is the old-fashioned and elastic c6. A lot of players play a6 in this position, and there are others who will simply play knight c6 or knight f6. But I think c6 is still a very viable option. It immediately threatens queen b6, taking advantage of two unprotected white pawns, and it points out to white that the bishop on g5 is leaving d4 unguarded. Also, the black queen may extend herself to come to a5, dependent on circumstances, and also gain time via the attack on the bishop on g5. So c6 is an interesting move, and I think unjustly ignored these days in favour of a6. The first game I'm going to show then is more or less an ideal example of how to play c6, and a warning to white that he can't do as he pleases against the modern defence. A lot of players, when they're given a free hand in the opening with white, think they can just trample all over you by playing just any attacking move they like. Well, we will see in a dramatic manner from the upcoming game that this is simply not the case. This game comes from the European Championship, which was played in Croatia in March 2010 between Adam Horvath, graded 2501, and Tigran El Petrosian, graded 2612. So these are players of Grandmaster standard. And in this game, white played Queen d2, which I suppose you could say is the logical follow-up to Bishop g5. Well, b5 was played. It's worth pointing out that Queen b6 in this position doesn't really have any effect because white would cast on the queen side, protecting the pawn on d4 and the pawn on b2 at the same time. Thus, b5 is a natural follow-up to c6 and create some action on the queen side if necessary. So white plays f4. So here he is, he's playing the two most aggressive. Hello, this is Andrew Martin welcoming you to volume 3 of our series on the modern defence. Welcome to DVD 3 in this series on the modern defence, where we will be looking at ways for black to play when white sets up with a queen's pawn system. This will be, I imagine, very common in your games if you play the modern defence. But the nice thing about 1g6 is that it affords black, most of all, I think, flexibility. And we're going to use this flexibility to our advantage when we're fighting against these queen's pawn systems. What then will we see on DVD 3? Okay, well, we'll certainly be looking at systems where white sets up with e4 and c4. This leads to a system known as the Averbach system. White is basically inviting black to go back into a King's Indian defence, and this is, of course, a very decent way to play. But I'm going to recommend that black stick with the modern defence individuality on this DVD, and I'm going to recommend the move e5. It's an attempt really to get an accelerated King's Indian defence where black deliberately leaves the knight on g8 at home for the time being, and who knows, at the right moment he may be able to go forward with the move f5. Certainly in some of the lines we'll be looking at, I'm going to be recommending this very aggressive move to you. It's an attempt to seize the initiative right at the outset. This approach seems extremely attractive. So white has tried to fight this in general at all levels, quite often by taking on e5. And one of the main lines we're going to be looking at in a moment is the line where the queens come off very early. Queen takes d8, king takes d8. And a lot of white players are going to go for this, feeling that, you know, perhaps black's king is going to be uncomfortable in the middle. I'm not so sure. I think the most important aspect of this position is that black controls the d4 square and white does not have d5. You can't compare the d4 and the d5 squares in this position because black can easily get rid of a white piece on d5 at the right moment by playing c6. White has no corresponding move. However, white does enjoy a certain initiative in this position. We must note that the bishop on g7 is currently blocked in, and black must know where to put his pieces in this line. I'm going to show you how to do that. Just dropping back to the position where the right at the start, g6, we're also going to be looking at some pesky queen's pawn systems after knight f3. At club level, I imagine this is going to crop up all the time as white heads for his favourite annoying queen's pawn system, something like the London system with bishop f4, or maybe even white will try to get a Tory attack with bishop g5. These systems work much better for white in my view when there's a black knight on f6. So again, we'll be looking to emphasise the individuality of the modern defence against these lines by delaying knight f6 until the right moment. But we kick off then with the Averbach system, and we'll head straight into our main line with c4, d6 and then knight c3. Mikhail Botvinnik considered this way of playing to be the acid test of fianchetto systems from black. White takes space in the centre and plays to cramp the black game right from the outset. It's hard to see a weak link in white's armour, but if there is one, it has to be the d4.
Okay, well, we are going now to plunge in at the deep end with possibly the most important variation of the Austrian attack, which is actually reached in our current game via a modern defence move order, but will quickly transpose to the Pirc after knight f6. And the most critical line starts with knight f3 and then bishop d3. I think this is one of white's most dangerous tries because of its simplicity in many ways. White protects the pawn on e4, he prepares to castle, and then he's going to follow up with moves like queen e1 and then queen h4. And of course there are also ideas of e5 and f5 in the air, so white has all these options on the table. I think the reason white prefers this in general over bishop e3 is that he doesn't know yet where he wants that bishop on c1. So black has to be very accurate against bishop d3. And I'm going to recommend the move knight a6 as one of black's best replies. This is a modern move. It's come into prominence over the past 20-30 years, and many strong players are using it as their main line. It's a logical move because it introduces ideas of knight b4 into the equation, and then black will certainly take off the bishop on d3 if he's allowed to do so. So my first game comes from the very recent European Championship played in Aix-les-Bains in March 2011 between female Grandmaster Anna Muzichuk, who's grades 2528, and Ivan Cheparinov, world-class Grandmaster, graded 2664. And in this game, Muzichuk just simply castles. That is the main line move. And now black plays a typical jab at the white centre, c5. I think bishop takes a6 by white in this position isn't really dangerous at any stage. White would cede the bishop pair and lose time, added to which you're giving up a valuable centrally placed bishop for an offside knight. So that really doesn't worry black in any way. Therefore, c5, as I said, hits at the white centre and forces white to make a decision. And the first move I'm going to look at here is d5. I mean, that is one of white's most common options in this position. White gains space in the centre and, well, invites black to try and find counterplay against this broad centre. And one way to do this is to play rook to b8, as Cheparinov does. So the position takes on the characteristic of the Benoni. With rook b8, black is thinking about preparing the move b5, and he can often put the knight on a6 back on c7 in order to help him do this, as we're going to see a little bit later down the line. Hello and welcome to Volume 2 of this three-part series on the Pirc. I'm International Master Andrew Martin. On this particular volume, we'll be looking at some very important systems that white can play against Pirc's defence. Let's get to the basic position after g6. And now the first of these systems is the g3 system. This can't be underestimated. Black must treat this with great respect. White's play in this variation creeps up on black and can often lead to a devastating kingside attack, despite the immediate impression that white's play is nothing special. White can also introduce the g3 variation via 4 knight ge2, followed by g3. In fact, this might be white's most accurate path to get into the g3 system. I repeat, black must be on the ball against this variation. Going back to g6, we'll also be looking at the rather crude attacking line where white puts his bishop out on c4, possibly followed by queen e2 and e5. In my view, this is one of white's least dangerous variations against the Pirc, and black has plenty of adequate ways to meet it, as we will see. Going back to g6, we then come to another very dangerous system, bishop g5, and I'll be treating this variation in some detail. This is the Bern variation, named after the American Grandmaster, and, well, it's a very fluid attacking concept. White's idea is based around queen d2, creating a battery of bishop and queen, and then the subsequent bishop h6. White may also play f4, with the dark square bishop outside the pawn chain. Well, once again, black has to treat this variation with great respect and care, and I'll be showing you how to do this a little bit later on.
Finally, and tying up a few loose ends, we'll look at the very rare move bishop f4. Again, this is not a particularly dangerous line, but black has to know what to do against it, as in all Pirc variations. Okay, well that's the intro. Now it's time for the substance. Well, the first system I'm going to examine on DVD 3 is the actual classical variation of the Pirc, where white just develops his pieces very sensibly. He brings both his knights out, he puts his bishop on the quiet square e2, and he gets his king to safety. Basically, there's nothing fancy about this approach at all. White is just trying to stay one step ahead of black in terms of development and claim a slight nagging edge in view of his command of the centre. And if that was all there was to it, then clearly the Pirc wouldn't be a very good defence. Black would just end up being slightly worse the whole game through and with no chance to break out. Naturally, this is not the case, and because of the placidity of white's development, black has plenty of choice in this position. That's not to say he's got plenty of good moves though. I mean, I would narrow the field of really good moves down to 3. Black can play bishop g4 here, he can play c6, or he can play my recommendation on this DVD, the straightforward move, knight to c6. Now clearly this move prepares e5. I think if black is allowed to play e5 in peace, he's probably going to do it, and then claim equality because he's got a foothold in the centre. So the first move I want to look at is clearly the critical move against knight c6, d5 by white. If this move establishes a clear advantage for white, then knight c6, well, is rather dubious. Fortunately for us, I think this is exactly the move black wants to see. That's not to say it's not white's best move, but d5 gives black something to chip away at, and therefore knight b8 is the recommended move here. This might seem a little bit strange, but black's idea is that he's going to chip away at the pawns by playing c6. Typical hyper-modern play, if you like, encouraging white to overextend and then hitting back reactively against the centre. And the first game I'm going to show you comes from the Dutch League in 2001 between international master Johan van Mil, who sadly has passed away. He was a friend of mine, very strong player, and Grandmaster Jeroen Piquet, one of Holland's best players and still remains so today, although I think he's probably retired tournament play. Well, okay, now white has a choice in this position, but the first move we're going to look at is Van Mil's move h3.
Hello everyone, I'm International Master and FIDE Senior Trainer Andrew Martin, and welcome to this Foxy Openings DVD on the St George defence. The St George defence is an unusual system of play for black, mapped out by the inventive international master from England, Michael Basman. It involves black playing the moves e6 and a6 on the first two moves, more or less irrespective of what white is doing. Imagine my surprise when, whilst researching this DVD, I came across no less than 3 different interpretations of the way black should handle this system. So we're going to look at each of them, so that you may have a choice as to what sort of system you play. In the first part of the DVD, we're going to look at the original interpretation as mapped out by Basman. That usually involves black playing b5 at a very early stage. Then we're going to switch to the Grandmaster from France, Christian Bauer's interpretation, where he likes to play this defence with an early d5, turning it into a kind of French defence, where the move a6 may or may not prove useful. Well, this guy has had terrific results with this method of play. Again, it's very unusual. Then we're going to look at Alexander Chernaev's representation of this system, where he often turns the game back into a kind of hippopotamus system, with black playing d6, maybe g6, maybe b6. It all depends on what white's doing. So this is an option preserving method by black, and I think it will be useful for you to have more than one interpretation of this defence. You know, you can play any one of these 3 systems and guarantee to surprise the opponent.